Schwarzenegger, I've read that you guys actually hated each other for a while.
Well, we were very competitive. Yeah, I think hate's a good word. It is.
There is a version of Sylvester Stallone that most people never see. Not the one throwing punches on screen, not the one pumping iron for a movie poster, but the one sitting across from people who smiled at his face and worked against him behind his back. The one who built friendships in this industry only to watch them collapse under the weight of ego, money, and betrayal. Hollywood has always been good at making enemies out of allies, and Stallone has had more than his fair share of both. What makes his story different is that he never really hid it. He talked. He called people out. He burned bridges in public and stood there watching them burn without flinching. Over the course of a career that spans more than 5 decades, certain names kept coming up. Certain relationships soured in ways that never fully healed. And today, we are going to walk through 5 of the most significant and most talked about falling outs in Stallone's career. These are not invented controversies. These are moments rooted in documented interviews, on-set reports, and public statements from the man himself and the people around him. So if you think you know the story of Sylvester Stallone, get ready, because the story behind the story is far more interesting than anything he ever put on film. Number 5, Richard Gere. Before Rocky, before Rambo, before any of the fame and the franchise deals and the action movie legacy, Sylvester Stallone was just another young actor grinding through low-budget productions and hoping something would stick. In 1974, he found himself on the set of a small film called The Lords of Flatbush, a period piece set in 1950s Brooklyn built around a group of young men navigating loyalty, romance, and street life. It was not a glamorous project. The budget was thin, the shooting schedule was punishing, and every person on that set knew they needed the film to work because they had nothing else lined up. Stallone had actually contributed to the writing of the script, pulling from his own upbringing and channeling something genuinely personal into the character he was playing. For him, this was not just a job. It was an opportunity to prove something. Also on that set was Richard Gere, a trained theater actor with a methodical, intellectual approach to performance. Where Stallone worked from instinct and emotion, Gere preferred to deconstruct a scene before playing it. In theory, different styles can complement each other. In practice, on a tight set with limited time and limited resources, that kind of friction can become unbearable very quickly. According to accounts from people involved with the production, the two men simply did not get along from the beginning. There was no single dramatic argument, no screaming match on day one. It was more of a slow burn of incompatibility that built pressure with every passing day. The tension eventually reached a breaking point during filming, and the situation became serious enough that the producers were forced to make a decision. They chose to keep Stallone and part ways with Gere. The official explanation offered to the press at the time used the familiar Hollywood phrase of creative differences, which has always been the industry's polite way of saying something far less diplomatic happened. Gere's scenes were reshot. His role was recast, and production moved forward. It was an early and jarring lesson in the politics of a film set, and it established something about Stallone's personality that would define his career going forward. He was not the type to quietly endure a situation that was not working. He was the type to push until something gave way. For Richard Gere, that early experience with Stallone left a mark. The two men moved in different circles for the rest of their careers, and there was never any public reconciliation or friendly interview where they laughed it all off. Some things in Hollywood simply do not get resolved. They just get filed away under unfinished business. Number 4, Bruce Willis. By the time Sylvester Stallone conceived the idea for The Expendables, he was operating from a place of genuine passion rather than financial desperation. The concept was straightforward but brilliant in its simplicity. Gather the action legends of the 80s and 90s, put them in one film together, and give audiences the kind of old-school, practical, muscle and sweat filmmaking that CGI-heavy blockbusters had largely replaced. The first film, released in 2010, exceeded expectations both critically in terms of fan reception and commercially, pulling in massive numbers at the global box office. The sequel built on that success. There was real momentum, and Stallone was proud of what he had created. This was not just a nostalgia project. It was a love letter to a generation of filmmaking that he had helped define. Bruce Willis was part of the ensemble from the beginning, playing a CIA operative whose presence gave the film a certain credibility and star power. Behind the scenes, from everything that has been reported, Willis was a respected part of the team during the first two films. When planning began for The Expendables 3, Stallone wanted to expand the cast, raise the stakes, and deliver something worthy of the franchise's growing fan base. He wanted Willis back. The character made sense, the audience knew the face, and continuity mattered. What happened next became one of the most publicly discussed salary disputes in recent Hollywood memory. According to Stallone himself, who addressed this directly and repeatedly in interviews, Willis's representatives came back with a financial demand that Stallone found not just excessive but philosophically incompatible with what the project stood for. The reported figure that circulated in entertainment news at the time was $4 million for 4 days of shooting. Stallone's position, expressed bluntly and without any apparent desire to soften the message, was that this demand represented exactly the wrong spirit for a film built on camaraderie and mutual respect among peers. He replaced Willis with Harrison Ford, who by all accounts arrived on set with enthusiasm and professionalism. Stallone did not stop there. In a now famous social media post that got picked up by every major entertainment outlet, he used the words greedy and lazy to describe Willis, which in Hollywood terms is about as direct and damaging a public statement as one person can make about another. The fallout was significant. Willis's public image took a hit at a time when he was already facing questions about his career choices. Stallone, for his part, seemed entirely comfortable with having said what he said. He had built his career on the idea that authenticity mattered more than diplomacy, and this was just another example of that principle in action. The friendship, or whatever version of friendship had existed between them, did not survive the dispute. In an industry where people rarely say exactly what they mean, Stallone said exactly what he meant, and the relationship paid the price. Number 3. Eddie Murphy. The friendship between Sylvester Stallone and Eddie Murphy during the 1980s was one of those rare Hollywood connections that seemed genuinely real rather than strategically convenient. Both men had come from difficult backgrounds. Both had clawed their way to the top of an industry that had not made it easy for them. Stallone had fought for years before Rocky gave him his breakthrough. Murphy had burned so bright so fast that by his mid-20s he was already one of the most commercially successful entertainers in the world. When they found themselves at the same level of fame, at the same parties, at the same industry events, something clicked. People who were around them at the time described a friendship that had actual warmth to it, not the performative kind that exists purely for cameras. Then the friendship ran into the specific kind of trouble that Hollywood is particularly good at generating. During the production of Beverly Hills Cop 2 in 1987, in which Stallone's then-wife Briette Nielsen appeared in a role, rumors began circulating about the nature of the relationship between Murphy and Nielsen on set. It is important to be clear here, these were rumors. They were never substantiated with any verified evidence, and both parties denied anything improper. But in the world of celebrity gossip, especially during the tabloid-driven media culture of the late 1980s, a denial rarely travels as fast as the original story. Stallone, by his own account and by accounts from people who observed his reaction at the time, was deeply affected by what he was hearing. He was not someone built for quiet dignity in the face of public humiliation, real or perceived. He addressed the situation directly with Murphy in a private conversation, rather than through publicists or lawyers, which in some ways reflects a certain blunt integrity even if the conversation itself was reportedly tense and painful. Murphy maintained that the rumors were false. Whether or not Stallone fully accepted that, the trust between them had been damaged in a way that proved irreparable. The friendship did not end with a dramatic public confrontation. It ended the quieter and more final way that most real friendships end, with silence. Phone calls stopped. Invitations stopped. Two people who had genuinely enjoyed each other's company found themselves on opposite sides of a wall that neither one moved to take down. The press, of course, turned their estrangement into a rivalry narrative, pitting their films against each other and treating every box office comparison as evidence of a war. The reality was probably less cinematic than that. Two men who had been friends stopped being friends, and both of them had to carry that loss while continuing to show up and perform for the public. Murphy would later speak with some sadness about how quickly the friendship unraveled. Stallone rarely discussed it in detail, which for him is its own kind of statement. The things that hurt the most are often the things he talks about the least. Number 2. Kirk Douglas. When Sylvester Stallone was developing First Blood in the early 1980s, he understood clearly what he had in John Rambo. This was not another action hero. This was a study in psychological damage, a portrait of a Vietnam veteran who had returned home to a country that did not know how to receive him, who carried wounds that were invisible but profound, and who eventually broke under the pressure of a society that had moved on without processing what it had asked its soldiers to do and to endure. Stallone fought to make sure the film honored that complexity. He was not interested in making a shallow action picture. He wanted to make something that resonated. Kirk Douglas, one of the defining stars of Hollywood's golden era, expressed interest in playing Colonel Sam Troutman, the commanding officer who understood Rambo better than anyone and whose presence in the story served as both antagonist and the character's only real connection to something human. On paper, casting Douglas was exciting. His reputation, his presence, and his history in the industry suggested he could bring genuine gravitas to the role. What actually happened during the early stages of production is well documented through interviews given by director Ted Kotcheff and others connected to the film. Douglas arrived with strong opinions not just about how he would play the character, but about how the story itself should end. The original novel by David Morrell, on which the screenplay was based, concluded with Rambo's death. Douglas reportedly felt strongly that this ending should be restored and that the film should conclude with Troutman killing Rambo. He pushed for this outcome persistently, raising it in meetings and apparently framing it not as a creative suggestion, but as a near condition of his participation. Stallone was opposed. He saw the film as the beginning of something larger, and beyond the commercial consideration of sequels. He felt that ending Rambo's story that would undermine the emotional journey the audience had been on. He was also, simply put, protective of a project he had invested enormous energy in shaping. The dynamic between the two men became increasingly difficult. Douglas was from a generation of filmmaking where stars of his caliber expected and received a certain degree of deference. Stallone was from a generation that had fought tooth and nail for creative control and was not about to surrender it to someone who had arrived on the project with a rewrite already in mind. The situation was resolved when Douglas departed the production. Director Kotcheff has spoken about this period, describing the creative differences as genuine and the parting as necessary for the film to move forward in the direction its creators intended. Richard Crenna stepped into the role of Troutman with remarkable speed and brought a warmth and quiet dignity to the character that became one of the most beloved elements of the finished film. First Blood went on to become a massive success and launched one of the most enduring franchises in action movie history. Stallone rarely spoke about the Douglas situation with hostility, but he also made clear in various interviews over the years that the experience reinforced his conviction that protecting a creative vision sometimes means making decisions that powerful people with powerful opinions do not like. He had learned that lesson first with Rocky, fighting the studio to keep himself in the lead role and to preserve the ending he believed in. He applied it again with First Blood. The pattern was becoming clear. Stallone would always choose the story over the relationship. Number 1. Arnold Schwarzenegger. No rivalry in the history of modern Hollywood was more entertaining, more sustained, or more consequential than the one between Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger. It began in the late 1970s and ran for the better part of 15 years, and during that time it shaped not just the careers of two individuals but the entire landscape of American action cinema. Understanding it requires going back to the beginning, to a moment that Stallone himself has described in interviews as the spark that set the whole thing off. The 1977 Golden Globes was supposed to be a celebration. Stallone had arrived on the back of Rocky, a film he had written himself, starred in himself, and fought for at every stage of development. It had been nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture. It had connected with audiences in a way that few films of any era managed to do. For a man who had been struggling financially just a year earlier, the recognition felt enormous and deeply personal. At the Golden Globes that evening, he encountered a large, extraordinarily confident Austrian man named Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was there as a newcomer making his presence felt in the entertainment industry. According to Stallone, Schwarzenegger introduced himself with a kind of self-assurance that immediately put people on notice. He was not there to observe. He was there to compete. The awards that evening did not go the way Stallone had hoped. Schwarzenegger, meanwhile, won the Golden Globe for New Star of the Year. And according to Stallone's own retelling of that night, Schwarzenegger's reaction to Rocky's shutout at the ceremony was visibly and repeatedly gleeful. Whether that is precisely accurate or somewhat sharpened by memory and ego, what matters is that Stallone experienced it that way, and he carried that experience with him. The rivalry that grew out of that evening was real and it was fierce. Through the 1980s, the two men operated in what felt like parallel universes that were constantly colliding. Stallone had Rocky and Rambo. Schwarzenegger built his own towering franchise legacy with Conan the Barbarian, The Terminator, Predator, and a string of massive commercial successes. Each man watched the other's box office numbers carefully. Each man paid attention to what the other was doing physically, creatively, and commercially. People inside the industry observed that the competition between them was a genuine motivating force. When one raised the bar, the other felt compelled to raise it further. The rivalry expressed itself in surprisingly creative ways. There were moments in each man's films that appeared to be direct commentary on or parody of the other. Stallone has confirmed in interviews that certain choices in his films during that period were made at least partly with Schwarzenegger in mind. Schwarzenegger has said similar things. The competitive energy between them was not just about who was bigger or stronger or had the higher grossing film. It was about who owned the space, who was the definitive action star of their generation. And that question did not have a clean answer, which kept the rivalry burning. The most often told story from this period involves a film called Stop, or My Mom Will Shoot, a comedy released in 1992 that starred Stallone and was widely considered one of the weakest films of his career. According to accounts that Schwarzenegger has shared over the years, including in his own memoir, he was aware the script was poor and deliberately allowed word to spread that he was interested in the role, knowing that Stallone's competitive instincts would push him to pursue it aggressively. The plan, if that is indeed what it was, worked. Stallone made the film. It failed. And Schwarzenegger enjoyed the outcome considerably. Stallone has spoken about this episode with a mixture of frustration and genuine amusement in later interviews, which tells you something about how the relationship eventually evolved. Because he is the part of the story that often gets overlooked. The rivalry ended. Not in a dramatic confrontation or public reconciliation press tour, but gradually and authentically. As both men moved into the later stages of their careers, as the specific pressures and insecurities of being at the absolute top of the action movie world began to ease, they found that the things they had in common outweighed the things they had been competing over. They became collaborators. They became, by all available evidence, genuinely friendly. They appeared together in the Expendables franchise with obvious mutual respect. They have spoken about each other in interviews with warmth and even affection. Schwarzenegger has said that the competition made him better. Stallone has said the same. And looking at the body of work that both men produced during the years when they were pushing hardest against each other, it is difficult to argue with that assessment. The Terminator exists in part because Schwarzenegger was trying to outshine Rambo. Rocky IV exists in part because Stallone was responding to the scale and spectacle of Schwarzenegger's films. Predator, Commando, the later Rocky sequels, all of these films carry the fingerprints of a rivalry that pushed both men to work harder, train more obsessively, and think more carefully about what they were offering audiences. The rivalry produced art, or at least it produced enormously entertaining cinema, which in the action genre amounts to the same thing. What the Schwarzenegger rivalry ultimately reveals about Stallone is something different from what the other names on this list reveal. With Gere, we see his volatility. With Willis, we see his sense of honor around loyalty and shared purpose. With Murphy, we see his vulnerability beneath the tough exterior. With Douglas, we see his commitment to creative vision over personal politics. But with Schwarzenegger, we see something more nuanced. We see a man who was capable of sustaining intense, consuming competition with someone he genuinely respected, and who was ultimately capable of letting that competition transform into something more generous once the stakes had changed. That is not the story most people expect when they hear about feuds and rivalries and lists of people who hated each other. But it might be the most honest version of who Sylvester Stallone actually is. A man built from conflict, yes. A man who pushed back hard and sometimes too hard, absolutely. But also a man who never stopped caring about the work, about the meaning of it, about what it was supposed to say, and who it was supposed to reach. Every name on this list connects to that drive in some way. Every falling out, Every dispute, every bridge burned or left to weather quietly in the rain was connected to the same core impulse. Stallone wanted things to matter. He wanted his films to mean something. And he was not willing to compromise that for anyone, regardless of their name, their reputation, or their history with him. That is what separates his story from a simple list of feuds. These were not random personality clashes. They were the collateral damage of a man who cared too much to pretend otherwise, and who never learned to want something quiet.